Greetings, traveler. If you keep getting cool ideas for your game and you don't know if you should include them or not, what I want to do today is share my three-step framework for making that decision as easy as possible. If you don't know who I am, my name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 15 years for companies like Electronic Arts, Cygames, TriAce, and a few others. I've worked on FIFA and Star Ocean and Rage of Bahamut, Idolmaster, and others in my time. And what I want to talk about today is something that I felt the strongest when I was working on a certain soccer title. And none other than a very high rank person at the time suggested that for the game to attract more users into the game, we should replace the tutorial explaining character with a, let's just say, very attractive young woman. And his reasoning was that if we do so, people will like her and more people will come to the game and more people will want to play the game. And what made things particularly difficult for us was that because that person was quite high ranking in the team, it was more difficult, especially in a Japanese work setting, to essentially not do as he requested. So at that time, I decided to put down a framework that would make it easy to decide whether an idea fits in a game or not, and is actually agnostic as to who talks about it, whether it's a high rank, low rank person, or someone outside of the game development team altogether. So I'm going to tell you what those rules were, and then I'm going to tell you how it turned out for the game itself. So first rule is, does it belong in the game's fantasy? So every game is trying to achieve something. Maybe you want to do a fantasy game with swords and dragons and elves and so on. So that's the aspiration of the game. Maybe you want to do a gritty, realistic shooter where you're half buried in the mud and you're fighting off all these enemies. Whatever the game is, it's trying to achieve something. So when someone says something like, yeah, but we should add zombies. Now, zombies are fun and they're they're a great feature in many games, but they have traits to them. So depending on your depiction of them, it could be super real. It could be light-hearted, as zombies appear in some games. They're comedic characters. Maybe they're cartoony characters, and that might not mesh well with your, let's say, very gritty, realistic game. Unless that was, of course, the goal of the game in the first place, in which case, yes, I suppose they would match. But then how do you make a decision based on that? Well, the second step of the framework is, what would that do for the player? How would that improve the player's experience? Or what benefit is there to the player should we add this feature? So here we're looking for practical benefits. Either it provides more story to explore, more areas to explore, fun little extra weapons or extra mechanics to master, giving the player more content, or it's a quality of life sort of thing that normally the player has to do this convoluted procedure to achieve what he wants, but if we add this feature, then the process stays just as fun, but it's less tedious, for example. Then if there's a value like that to the player, of course it would make a lot of sense to add it. But still, we cannot make a decision just on those two questions alone, because we have to be realistic, right? So that brings us to the third question, which is the time and budget and so on of the idea. So unfortunately, back then, at least, there was no way for us to instantly materialize all of our ideas. So we had to make an educated decision about whether that would belong, or rather that could materialize in the game or not. So did we have the time to do it? Did we have the budget to do it? And I don't know if you've experienced this for yourself, but whenever you're developing games, it's constantly a battle with budget and time, right? So you have all these ideas, and even if they perfectly match the game, you perhaps don't have the time, or you don't have the budget to include them all. So some have to stay and some have to be perhaps future content. So the way you can decide about this is, you unfortunately have to put a number to all of them and say, okay, from all these wonderful ideas, which ones do we do first? and which ones do we develop or do we simply introduce a little bit later. So that is the last key point. So if it belongs in the game's fantasy or aspiration, and if it has a tangible benefit to the player, it's not just an add-on that most people will never see, and it's something that we can realistically include in the game in its current state or with the remaining time and budget, then I would say that yes, perhaps that's a good idea to add into the game. Now, if it fails any of these things, and we put them in this order to make sure that we cut off the strangest ones early without devoting too much energy into the decision-making process. If something doesn't make sense to exist in the game, then we don't need to evaluate it any further. If your game is not about fantasy, then you can't have zombies. It's very simple. So based on that, we can make this decision based on this three-step process. And to get back to the example I was talking about before, despite that person's suggestion for the attractive young woman in the tutorial, the type of fantasy we were going for back then was not, let's just say, in that direction. What we had in mind was just a simple soccer game that soccer fans would enjoy. So we ended up not going for that character, and that was pretty unanimous to agree with on the team, because that suggestion failed on all three questions, right? It definitely didn't belong in the game, since it's not a vital component of explaining the game mechanics to the players, and besides, we already had a character doing that who was very much on theme. We didn't identify any benefit for the player. I mean, other than the obvious, I suppose. But I suppose in gameplay terms, the new character could not do a better job explaining the game than what we already had. All the explanation was already in the game. And finally, going out and finding that person and setting up the new photo shoot and all the incorporation back into the game would be quite a bit of additional time and money we would need on a team that was already extremely stressed and extremely thin on remaining time and money. So it was unrealistic, on top of not on target for us. So that is why in the end we decided not to do it. Anyway, that's the quick framework I developed back then for making that decision, and I've used it ever since to very quickly decide not whether ideas are bad or good, because ideas about games can, of course, always be good, and it would be great if we could have all the ideas in all of the games always. But in the real world, we have to assign priorities. So when assigning priorities, that definitely helped me. And if you have a way of doing this for yourself, please go ahead and share. I'll be very interested to take a look at that. Anyway, that's it for me for today. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, have fun.